Right, this is revision session 4.2 for Unit 1. How did the Cold War develop in the years after 1949? You've already got 4.1, the origins. This is 4.2, how the Cold War developed. After the Berlin Blockade, that was the last thing. The Berlin Blockade and the Berlin Airlift was the last thing we looked at as part of the last section. So building on that, the Berlin Blockade was like a bit of a wake-up call for the Americans. They realised that they needed to do something to defend the free world against the spread of the USSR. So the thing they came up with was the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, so NATO. And the first thing we're going to look at as part of this section is NATO. So we're looking at, just to give you a rundown or an overview of what we're looking at as part of this little session, we're going to look at the formation of NATO. We're going to look at the nuclear arms race that came out of NATO and the USSR's decision to build nuclear bombs. I'm just going to shut these windows because we can hear the primary school making a racket all the road. Might get a bit warm in here, but it's better than here in the primary school, right? Oh, Rob. Would you do me a favour? Will you just shut those windows, please? Never got around to them. Okay, so yeah, we've got the nuclear arms race, and then we've got the Korean War. The Korean War is quite a lengthy section. It goes back and forwards. We get the UN involved, and then we need to look at the significance of the Korean War, why it was important, and then we look at the Thaw of the Cold War. That means, kind of the two major powers, NATO and the Warsaw Pact, becoming a little bit more friendly. That's what we mean by the thaw. It's a Cold War, so the thawing of relations means things got a little bit more pleasant between them. And then we look at the Warsaw Pact, the formation of the Warsaw Pact, and how that was like a communist version of NATO, set up against NATO. So, to begin with, formation of NATO. Formed in April 1949. It was a military agreement where members agreed to help one another in the face of an act of aggression, meaning an act of aggression by the Soviet Union more than anything else. So this is the description, this is what NATO was. It was supposed to have an army with a joint command, so it was a military organisation, and in 1949 it had 12 members. USA, Britain, France, Italy, Belgium, Holland, Luxembourg, Norway, Portugal, Iceland, Denmark, Canada. And eventually in 1915 you get Greece and Turkey in there, and West Germany in 1955. Basically the significance, so we're going to do DEA, right? Okay, we've described what it was, we've explained how it grew and which countries were part of it. The significance, the analysis, if you like, the A of the DEA, is it meant that the Americans could build air bases in Western Europe, okay? Where aeroplanes with nuclear bombs could be ready for use against the Soviet Union, or nominally against an aggressive state, but really we're talking about against the Soviet Union. Right, so that's your DEA of NATO. Right, move on to the nuclear arms race. Well, DEA, the nuclear arms race. First of all, what was the arms race? Well, it's pretty significant and it's pretty easy to understand the significance of this. The first nuclear bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki as part of World War II. We've already established that Truman didn't share that information with Stalin. Stalin knew that the Americans had a nuclear bomb. He had spies that had given him this information, but Stalin wasn't aware that Truman was going to use them. They weren't aware that he had tested them. So Stalin... we've already established the significance of the atom bomb when we looked at the origins of the Cold War, and the fact that the atom bomb scared Stalin and made Stalin more suspicious of the West. After the atomic bomb is dropped in 1945, Stalin decides that he wants one as well. So the description of the nuclear arms race is exactly what it says. Yeah, it's both sides just stepping up their nuclear arsenal. This was like the major thing of the Cold War, the threat of nuclear Armageddon. neither side wanting to be left behind, left at a disadvantage. So as a new development came in, for example, to begin with, nuclear bombs were transported by aeroplanes, B-52s famously. But eventually, rocket technology took off to such an extent that ballistic missiles became the preferred mode of delivery for nuclear weapons, and that was another stage. Nuclear submarines, for example, was another stage in the nuclear arms race. Both sides started to build up massive stockpiles of nuclear weapons. Until 1949, America was in front. The USSR couldn't risk a war against America because America had nuclear weapons and the USSR didn't. However, in 1949, the USSR detonated its first atomic bomb. The next stage in the race was the hydrogen bomb. So the hydrogen bomb, more deadly than the atom bomb. Americans used B-52s as the mode of delivery for these, or would, in the event of a war. A hydrogen bomb was 2,000 times more powerful than the atom bomb. The Soviets responded by building their own hydrogen bomb in 1953, and this was like the theme of the arms race. It just got more significant, more deadly as time went on. The acronym that they used to describe this is MAD, Mutually Assured Destruction, which is quite appropriate that it makes the acronym MAD, because it was mad to ever drop a nuclear bomb on anybody, because it would simply result in the other side dropping a nuclear bomb on the aggressor. So it would be mutually assured destruction, and it would be mad to even use them. Okay, so that's where we were at by the early 1950s. Both sides had nuclear weapons, and it was in that context that the Korean War started, and that's the next thing we need to DEA. What was the Korean War? Well, it was an extension really of the Cold War. It happened in Korea between the North Koreans and the South Koreans. Just give you a little bit of background. North Korea was divided along the 38th parallel. The Americans supported the South Koreans, who were a capitalist democracy led by Syngman Rhee. Okay, Syngman Rhee. That's Syngmanrhee. North Korea was communist, and it was led by Kim Il-sung. The capital of North Korea was Pyongyang. The capital of South Korea is Seoul. Doesn't take a genius to work out that North Korea was backed by the Soviets. And after Chairman Mao's victory in China, Chairman Mao Zedong in 1949 was also backed by Chinese communists as well. Okay, so North Korea is getting a bit cocky, getting a bit belligerent in 1949 because it's supported not only by the Soviet Union but also by China, both massive neighbours to the north. Now, why is Truman concerned about this? Well, it's because of the Truman Doctrine and the need to contain. Remember that word, containment? The need to contain communism and not allow it to spread. So, the Americans decide that they will step in to preserve that 38th parallel, the border between North and South Korea. However, North Korea as I said, they feel confident, and Kim Il-sung, the leader of North Korea, wants to unite all of Korea under one communist government. So he invades with the backing of the support of the Chinese government. He invades. Stalin also encouraging the North Koreans to invade. And they're successful. The North Koreans push the South Koreans down to the southeast corner of Korea, called the Pusan Pocket. You need that. That's key information. So the North Korean invasion pushes the South Koreans back to the Pusan Pocket. That's Pusan, Pusan Pocket. And that basically just describes a small area of South Korea where the South Koreans were pushed back to. And the Americans get concerned about this, and without UN backing to begin with, they send soldiers from Japan over to the Pusan Pocket to help the South Koreans defend themselves. And eventually the UN agrees that North Korea is the bad guy, and they condemn the actions, and they order the North Koreans back to the 38th parallel. They support intervention. Now, that's significant because the USSR might have opposed that at the United Nations, but the USSR were not present in the United Nations Security Council at the time. Why were the USSR not present at the United Nations Security Council? It was because the UN had refused to recognize the communist government of China. So the fact that the USSR were not at the Security Council when the vote was taken on whether to take action in Korea meant that the UN pretty much unanimously, the Security Council certainly unanimously, agreed to support the South Koreans. Okay? So America, the force that went over there, the UN force that went over there, was led by Americans. The general in charge was General Douglas MacArthur. You need that as a key word, okay? So under General Douglas MacArthur, the UN sent a group of soldiers to fight the North Koreans and push them back to the 38th parallel. It should have ended there, but the Americans went further. The UN went further than they should. They overstepped their remit, and they pushed the North Koreans back beyond the 38th parallel. This was going beyond containment. Okay, we're in the explanation here. We're explaining how the Korean War developed, how it went on. So the UN force under MacArthur pushed the North Koreans back beyond the 38th parallel up to the Yalu River, Y-A-L-U, the Yalu River, almost to the border with China. As you can imagine, this worried the Chinese government, the communist government. They don't like the idea of a UN force led by Americans on their doorstep. So, an army of 250,000 supposed volunteers from the Chinese army invaded Korea to help the North Koreans. So you've got Chinese volunteers, you've got UN soldiers fighting on opposite sides. Now, most of the fighting ended in 1951, but it took until 1953 for the two sides to sit down at the Peace of Panmunjom and agree to re-establish the 38th parallel. So, evaluate this. Was it a success? Was the American and the UN involvement in Korea a success for the Americans? Yes, it was. They re-established the 38th parallel. It was also quite embarrassing, though, because they were forced back from the Yalu River by a Chinese army. So in that sense, it was also a victory for communism. It was a draw, essentially. But in terms of their original aims, the American government had succeeded in containing the threat of communism. They had stopped the domino effect. So in that sense, it was a success. In terms of consequences, the analysis, the war was costly for Korea. 4 million soldiers and civilians who had been killed. 4 million Korean soldiers and civilians were killed. 5 million people were homeless. American losses were around 50,000, about 50,000 American lives lost. And other UN troops were around about 17,000. The Chinese suffered about 900,000 casualties, okay? So in terms of human life, that was the consequence of the Korean War. But let's look in more detail at the consequences politically and socially at the time, the importance of the Korean War. It was evidence that the Cold War was spreading into the Far East, okay, involving China. China was now a player in the Cold War. It also meant that China was more willing to get involved in supporting communists in Vietnam against the French occupying forces. Vietnam was a French colony at the time, so before the Americans got involved, later in the 60s, the Chinese were willing to help support the Vietnamese communists there. Okay, so that was one reason. It encouraged China to get more involved in supporting communist causes in the Far East. It showed that Truman was willing to stick to the Truman Doctrine and prevent the domino effect from occurring. But, significantly, it also proved that neither of the major powers was willing to turn the Cold War into a hot war. both sides stepped back from the use of nuclear weapons. General Macarthur, Douglas Macarthur, had wanted to use nuclear weapons against China, and it was Truman that stopped him. Okay, so it showed that common sense prevailed when it came to the idea of mutually assured destruction. So although it showed that the Cold War was kind of spreading out into the Far East, it also showed that really it was unlikely ever to turn into a hot war. It marked the emergence of China as a global power. It showed that the UN, the United Nations, was actually an effective force, much more than its predecessor, the League of Nations, had been, because it actually got involved. It bared its teeth. It showed that it could change things and get involved in a fight. The USSR, although it wasn't directly involved in the Korean War, it did supply weapons to North Korea. And the result for Korea was that it was still divided along the 38th parallel, and it's still divided today. Okay, next section, the Thaw. Following the death of Stalin in 1953, Soviet foreign policy went in a new direction. Both sides had the hydrogen bomb, and it seemed sensible to kind of cool the Cold War if possible. Particularly now that the Korean War had been resolved, it was hoped that they could kind of calm things down a little bit.
Who was in power in Russia?
Sorry?
Who was in power in Russia after Stalin died?
Well, it was a little bit of kind of a little bit of a power vacuum until Khrushchev took over. So it was Khrushchev who was the next significant leader. First example of the Thaw was in the USSR helping to end the Korean War. Okay, so they agreed. The USSR were willing to kind of meet around the negotiating table and put an end to this war. So this is the explanation. This is developing this point. The next stage was the Austrian State Treaty, where the Soviets agreed to end their occupation of Austria, which they'd been occupying since 1945. Austria, like Germany, had been divided into 4 zones. Austria, as a result, became an independent country, and that was another sign that the Soviets were willing to kind of reduce the tension. The new Soviet leadership was at first a coalition, but eventually Khrushchev was the leader. He was very critical of Stalin. He basically slagged off what Stalin had done, and this was seen as a way of easing tension with the West. Khrushchev was photographed with Western world leaders. He was much more willing to engage in dialogue than Stalin. Okay, Khrushchev, you'll need the spelling Khrushchev. He argued that the idea of transporting communism around the world was dead, and the best thing that the Soviets could do was make peace with the West and live in harmony, He's famous for coming up with the phrase peaceful coexistence. That's a key word. Peaceful coexistence was Khrushchev's phrase to show that he wanted to peacefully coexist with the West. He visited Britain and he visited the USA. And there was a summit conference held in Geneva in 1955. You need that, okay? The Geneva Conference, 1955. The first time since 1945 that all these hostile countries' leaders had met. Not much was agreed, but the fact that they all managed to get around the table at the Geneva 1955 conference was a big step forward. So that's another point. So in terms of analysing that Thaw, nothing really concrete came out of it, but it was a sign that both sides were unwilling to use, another sign that both sides were unwilling to use that hydrogen bombs that they had. Neither side really wanted a war. It's been argued that the Soviets they liked to make a noise at home to say that they hated the West, to kind of gain popular support amongst other Russians. But really, when it came to foreign policy, they weren't willing to invade and start an actual hot war. Okay, right. The last thing we're going to look at now is the Warsaw Pact. In 1955, West Germany joined NATO. West Germany right on the doorstep of, obviously East Germany, which was under communist control. So this made the Soviets worried about the re-emergence of a united, or claims for a united Germany, and it led to the formation of the Warsaw Pact, a military agreement for mutual defence. Now this is it's like an Eastern version of NATO. Just like we started this section with NATO, we're ending it with the Warsaw Pact. You've got Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Albania, Romania and Bulgaria, all part of this agreement to support one another in case of an invasion by the West. And they're all communist countries, all satellites really of the Soviet Union, of Russia rather. They all signed up to the idea of collective security and that they should unite to prevent war. It was described as a treaty of friendship, cooperation and mutual assistance. However, tellingly, the country that was in charge of the Warsaw Pact was Russia, Soviet Union. A Soviet commander-in-chief would lead Soviet troops, and Soviet troops were to be stationed in each of the countries of the Warsaw Pact. So really, they were opening their doors to domination, even more domination by the Soviet Union. Eventually, the Warsaw Pact, less than becoming a kind of way of supporting all the countries, mutual support, it became more a way of allowing the Soviet Union to dominate the member countries. And it's here, as part of the Warsaw Pact, we start to see the Soviet Union using that Warsaw Pact as an excuse to put down rebellions in Hungary and in Czechoslovakia. The formation of the Warsaw Pact meant that the division of Europe was now marked by two rival alliances. If there was a war, it would mean that all the countries of NATO were involved and all the countries of the Warsaw Pact would be involved as well. Okay. The last thing we need to include as part of this section is the Hungarian Uprising. In 1956, the Hungarians rose up against the Soviet domination of the country. The death of Stalin had encouraged the de-Stalinization of the country. And in October 1956, students, workers and soldiers attacked the secret police there and smashed the statue of Stalin. So this is the description of what was going on in Hungary at the time. Imre Nagy is the person that you really need to know. N-A-G-Y, Imre Nagy. His first name is Imre, I-M-R-E, and his surname is Nagy, N-A-G-Y. He was a westernizer and he took over as prime minister. Nagy asked Khrushchev to take the Russian troops out, and Khrushchev agreed, and the Russian army pulled out of Budapest, capital of Hungary. For 5 days there was freedom in Hungary, and a new Hungarian government introduced democracy, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, etc. Then, on the 3rd of November, Nagy announced that Hungary was going to leave the Warsaw Pact, but Khrushchev was never going to allow this, and he claimed that he'd received a letter from the Hungarian communist leaders asking for his help. On the 4th of November, 1,000 Russian tanks rolled into Hungary, into Budapest. They destroyed the Hungarian army and captured Hungarian radio. The last words broadcast were apparently "help, help, help." Hungarian people, even children, fought the Russian troops with machine guns, and some 4,000 Hungarians were killed. Khrushchev put in János Kadar as prime minister in place of Imre Nagy. Nagy was arrested and eventually killed. Okay. This proved that the Thaw was only went so far. Although Khrushchev was willing to meet with other world leaders, Western world leaders around the table at Geneva in 1955, he wasn't going to allow countries that were already part of that Soviet sphere of influence to leave the Warsaw Pact. He was much like Truman wasn't willing to allow that domino effect. Khrushchev was worried about a similar domino effect in countries of the Warsaw Pact. If Hungary was allowed to leave, then maybe other countries would want to leave the Warsaw Pact as well. Okay, so the Thaw only went so far. So that's the consequence. That's the analysis. What did the Hungarian Uprising show? It showed that Khrushchev, despite the Thaw, wasn't willing to allow countries like Hungary to leave the Warsaw Pact, and was willing to use force to force them to stay in the Warsaw Pact. Okay, that's basically everything we need to know for 4.2, development of the Cold War.